Again, we close with some of the best humorous writing of the 20th century. Fridays with Thurber, James Thurber, author, illustrator, essayist, reporter. This started, if you don't know, when I would read him to my late father in the hospital. Dad said you would enjoy this, and by all indications, he was right, as usual. This week, 3 gems from Thurber's Fables for Our Time and Famous Poems Illustrated, published first in 1940. And I am again reading from the Library of America, Thurber Writings and Drawings, just reprinted because you asked for it. First, The Mouse Who Went to the Country by James Thurber. Once upon a Sunday, there was a city mouse who went to visit a country mouse. He hid away on a train that the country mouse had told him to take, only to find out that on Sundays it did not stop at Beddington. Hence, the city mouse could not get off at Beddington and catch a bus for Seibert's Junction, where he was to be met by the country mouse. The city mouse, in fact, was carried on to Middleburg, where he waited 3 hours for a train to take him back. When he got back to Beddington, he found that the last bus for Seibert's Junction had just left, so he ran and he ran and he ran, and he finally caught the bus and crept aboard, only to find that it was not the bus for Seibert's Junction at all, but was going in the opposite direction through Pell's Hollow and Grum to a place called Wimberby. When the bus finally stopped, the city mouse got out into a heavy rain and found that there were no more buses that night going anywhere. "To hell with it," said the city mouse, and he walked back to the city. Moral? Stay where you are, you're sitting pretty. The Mouse Who Went to the Country. And now, The Moth and the Star by James Thurber. A young and impressionable moth once set his heart on a certain star. He told his mother about this, and she counseled him to set his heart on a bridge lamp instead. "Stars aren't the thing to hang around," she said. "Lamps are the thing to hang around." "You get somewhere that way," said the moth's father. "You don't get anywhere chasing stars." But the moth would not heed the words of either parent. Every evening at dusk, when the star came out, he would start flying toward it, and every morning at dawn he would crawl back home, worn out with his vain endeavor. One day his father said to him, "You haven't burned a wing in months, boy. It looks to me as if you're never going to. All your brothers have been badly burned, flying around street lamps, and all your sisters have been terribly singed, flying around house lamps. Come on now, get out of here and get yourself scorched. A big strapping moth like you without a mark on him." The moth left his father's house, but he would not fly around street lamps, and he would not fly around house lamps. He went right on trying to reach the star, which was 4 1/3 light years, or 25 trillion miles away. The moth thought it was just caught in the top branches of the elm. He never did reach the star, but he went on right on trying night after night, and when he was a very, very old moth, he began to think that he really had reached the star, and he went around saying so. This gave him a deep and lasting pleasure, and he lived to a great old age. His parents and his brothers and his sisters had all been burned to death when they were quite young. Moral? Who flies afar from the sphere of our sorrow is here today and here tomorrow. The Moth and the Star. And lastly tonight, and best tonight, The Owl Who Was God by James Thurber. Once upon a starless midnight, there was an owl who sat on the branch of an oak tree. 2 ground moles tried to slip quietly by unnoticed. "You," said the owl. "Who?" they quavered in fear and astonishment, for they could not believe it was possible for anyone to see them in that thick darkness. "You too," said the owl. The moles hurried away and told the other creatures of the field and forest that the owl was the greatest and wisest of all animals because he could see in the dark and because he could answer any question. "I'll see about that," said a secretary bird, and he called in the owl one night when it was again very dark. "How many claws am I holding up?" said the secretary bird. "2, said the owl, and that was right. "Can you give me another expression for that is to say, or namely?" asked the secretary bird. "To wit," said the owl. "Why does a lover call on his love?" asked the secretary bird. "To woo," said the owl. The secretary bird hastened back to the other creatures and reported that the owl was indeed the greatest and wisest animal in the world because he could see in the dark and because he could answer any question. "Can he see in the daytime too?" asked a red fox. "Yes," echoed a dormouse and a French poodle. "Can he see in the daytime too?" All the other creatures laughed loudly at this silly question, and they set upon the red fox and his friends and drove them out of the region. Then they sent a messenger to the owl and asked him to be their leader. When the owl appeared among the animals, it was high noon and the sun was shining brightly. He walked very slowly, which gave him an appearance of great dignity, and he peered about him with large, staring eyes, which gave him an air of tremendous importance. "He's God!" screamed a Plymouth Rock hen, and the others took up the cry, "He's God!" So they followed him, and wherever he went, and when he began to bump into things, they began to bump into things too. Finally, he came to a concrete highway, and he started up the middle of it, and all the other creatures followed him. Presently, a hawk, who was acting as an outrider, observed a truck coming toward them at 50 miles an hour, and he reported to the secretary bird, and the secretary bird reported to the owl. "There's danger ahead," said the secretary bird. "To wit," said the owl. The secretary bird told him, "Aren't you afraid?" he asked. "Who?" said the owl calmly, for he could not see the truck. "He's God!" cried all the creatures again, and they were still crying, "He's God!" when the truck hit them and ran them down. Some of the animals were merely injured, but most of them, including the owl, were killed. Moral? You can fool too many of the people too much of the time. The owl who was God. And that is Countdown. Portions written by James Thurber. And now to discuss Arizona's expanding fight against illegal immigrants and now their kids. Ladies and gentlemen, in for Rachel Maddow, here is Chris Hayes. Good evening, Chris.
Good evening, Keith. Thank you so much. I am indeed not Rachel Maddow. She is under the weather and getting better as fast as she can in anticipation of Geek Week.